Hello and welcome to Looking to Score, the podcast where we geek out about movie scores, their composers, and everything else in between. I'm Breanne, and joining me, as always, is the master of ceremonies, Brett Blake. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
Excellent. Now today, we are bringing you John Williams, the sequel.
Part 2.
Oh my god, just when you thought we were done with John Williams, we bring him back in.
Yeah, we're never done with John Williams.
Never.
I think this is the lesson of this episode.
All right, but before we get into it, we're going to give you our pre-show picks, where we give you recommendations as to what we're listening to as of late. So, Brett, what are you listening to?
So my pre-show pick today is the score for the movie Pearl by Tyler Bates and Tim Williams. And I will have more to say about this because this is going to be one of my favorite scores of this year at the end of the year.
Sure.
But all I'll say at this point is that it's fantastic, extremely old-fashioned in the best way, and it's easily the best thing that Tyler Bates has his name on. So if you're interested in sort of classic Hollywood-inspired film scoring, absolutely check out Pearl.
Yeah, totally agree with that one. I am listening to the Amazon series soundtrack to Night Sky by Danny Vence and Sandra Jurians. And let me tell you, there have been a lot of great TV scores this year, and this is one of them. So if you are looking for some wonderful string and piano work, this is it. It creates this very space-like, contemplative, atmospheric feeling. And it's just one of those scores that you might be able to put on in the background while you're working or reading. It's just one of those. It has a lot of good stuff in it. So definitely check out The Night Sky. All right. Now to the good stuff.
Yes.
Why are we returning to John Williams?
I mean, it's a fair question. And, you know, we could be glib and flippant about it, which we kind of were at the beginning, because it's like, of course, we want to talk about John Williams as often as we can. But the more realistic answer is that his career is just way too vast to think that it could be done justice in a single episode. And we want to be able to highlight some of his versatility, the different kinds of sound that he's able to create in his scores.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is a composer who's tackled basically every genre, every size and scale of film, not just the legendary sort of classics that he's known for. So we wanted to take this opportunity to dig a little deeper. Some of these are somewhat well-known scores we're going to talk about. Some of them are a little deeper cuts. But we just wanted to be able to cover his career from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, and we're kind of breaking this down into different areas. We've come up with 4 different areas. They kind of have somewhat arbitrary start and end points.
Yes, but I think when you really look at his career, if you look at the list of all the films he's scored, there are some pretty natural lines of demarcation that represent, to me anyway, as I think about his career, pretty distinctive shifts. So I guess maybe we'll just talk about these to begin with, sort of set the ground rules of what maybe the listeners should listen for as we then talk about the scores.
Sure.
So the first chunk I would sort of classify as his quote-unquote early period, which would be his stuff in the 60s up through, say, 1974, basically up until Jaws.
So the Johnny Williams years.
Yeah. So this is, you know, a lot of the scores here are heavily jazz influenced, have a kind of a lighter, frothier sort of touch. Now, these are generalizations. Like, not every score meets this. There are darker scores in this period. Images, the Robert Altman film that he scored, definitely is not light and frothy or jazzy. That's a very dark piece. But in general, you can hear more of his jazz background because that's how he sort of entered the music scene. That is much more prevalent during this period than it would be going forward beyond it, even though he would always touch upon jazz, you know, fairly frequently after that. Another component during this time is the musicals that he worked on. He adapted the scores from several stage musicals for film, and he won his first Oscar by doing that, and that's something that we'll touch on later here. And one other thing in this period, you begin to hear sort of the early hints of how strong a writer of themes Williams is. They're not always quite as fully formed and memorable as what would come, but you can definitely hear that sort of, I don't know if you'd say operatic, that symphonic kind of thematic development. The seeds of that begin to be planted here in this first period, this early period. Moving on then, I guess starting with Jaws in 1975, arguably up until Jurassic Park in 1993 would be sort of like the golden era of John Williams, his most iconic era, representing much of his best work across a huge variety of genres and sizes of movies. Then the interesting shift really happens the same year as Jurassic Park, which is Schindler's List. From Schindler's List onward until about 2005 would be what I'm calling here his experimental era. So this is a period that's marked by Williams exploring much more emotionally mature and complex musical tones and moods, even in the big movies, even in the blockbusters that he scored during this period. And what particularly jumps out to me when I think of this period of years, about 12 years, is the sort of tragic writing, this writing that's sort of heavily infused by a sense of lamentation. I think he really gets into that during this period in a really effective way. So that takes us to 2005. And then he took basically several years off at the end of 2005. 2005 was a big year. He scored 4 films that year, so he earned a couple years off. And then he returns in 2008 with the 4th Indiana Jones. And then up to the present day, I would sort of call this his modern era, which is a little bit of everything, very eclectic. You know, he scored huge movies, small movies, historical dramas, science fiction, action, really kind of a grab bag era. And I think he's actually done some of his very best work within the last 10 years. And we'll touch on a couple of those scores later on in this episode.
Sure. Well, let's get into it. We'll start with the early period first, and I know you have a couple picks here, and I do as well. So we'll be highlighting our picks in each section that we go through.
Sure. So my first pick for this early period is the score that he wrote for a movie called How to Steal a Million, which was from 1966. And you're going to hear a piece from the main title. And this is an example of that kind of frothier element that I mentioned. The movie is a caper. It's pretty lightweight. And I think Williams is able to convey that in a very upbeat and bright sort of way. So here's How to Steal a Million.
Yeah, and you get a lot of that familiar punctuated brass and
Yes.
percussion, like especially with, xylophone hits and
Yep.
trademark John Williams sound coming through. All right, so I'm going to highlight the Cowboys from 1972. And I put this one on here because I think it's probably the best example of his beginning to foray into the realm of really strong, memorable themes. And it has an absolutely rousing opening that will eventually be something akin to his later marches, like in Superman or Midway or 1941.
Mhm.
But we hear this lush, sweeping melody in the later portion of this cue that really kind of evokes some of the more grand thematic writing we'll hear in Williams' Golden Age. So here's the overture from the Cowboys.
Yeah, the Cowboys is possibly my favorite score from this early period of his. Um, don't hold me to that because if I think about it too long, I might come up with another option, but it's a great score.
Yeah.
So my next pick for the early period is from Earthquake, 1974, and it's a cue called Something for Rosa. So Earthquake is one of his disaster scores. And it's kind of a grab bag of different styles. You know, the disaster stuff is handled in a pretty dark and dramatic way musically, but the score also has elements of funk. And this cue in particular is basically textbook light lounge jazz from John Williams in this era. He produced several cues that sound kind of very much like this in a few other scores that he did during this time. And this is a pretty good example of what his jazz sound from this era was. So here's Something for Rosa.
Man, this cue feels like I should be having a drink and not getting work done in Don Draper's office. You know, not be getting caught in an earthquake.
Exactly.
All right, the next cue we're going to highlight here is from Sugarland Express from 1974. And there are two different themes for Sugarland Express, but I wanted to highlight this version mainly because of the pacing and how distinctly 70s it feels. So we get more of that jazz influence here, particularly with the solo harmonica.
I have an interesting anecdote about the Sugarland Express score. John Williams apparently does not want this score officially released. There's never been an
Why?
official release of the complete score to Sugarland Express. Nobody knows exactly why. I know some of the producers at a couple of the boutique labels that have handled the expansions of some of his scores and have sort of relationships with John Williams have asked him, like, hey, can we please do Sugarland Express because it's never been released? And they always get shut down.
Hmm.
And Williams has been very cagey about his reasons why. So for some reason, I guess John Williams doesn't like this score very much because it's the only one that he has said, no, I don't want this released.
Yeah,
So,
I was kind of wondering that, like, why. Someone put on YouTube a kind of mashup of cues that
right,
it doesn't sound that great, but I mean it's something.
right. There
So
have been bootlegs.
yeah,
People have gotten in, whether it's from, the old DVDs, they've been able to rip tracks off the audio. But yeah, nothing official has ever been released for this. So it's curious. So you can make of
hmm.
that what you will. I don't have an explanation for it. Then we wanted to throw in, just kind of as a bonus here, because we mentioned he worked on musicals. Wanted to touch on Fiddler on the Roof, because this is the score that won Williams' first Oscar. And even though the bulk of it is him embellishing arrangements from the stage production, there are a few moments where he was sort of allowed to go off on his own. And you can hear an example of that in the cue called First Act Finale. You get this really intense buildup that sounds pretty dire, and then it climaxes in a truly sort of massive way that kind of foreshadows the sort of epic sound that Williams could create later in his career.
Yeah, and he did a couple other musicals during this time. I believe Goodbye, Mr. Chips and Tom
Yep.
Sawyer were
Yep.
the others. But yeah, I think during this time, arranging a musical for film is will kind of give you a shoe in for an Oscar.
Or at least the nomination,
Sure. And
because it had its own category for a while.
yeah,
So,
yeah, it's true. Again, you can hear in those orchestrations that trademark Williams sound, a lot of that sharp brass and string flourishing.
all right, so let's move on to the golden era of John Williams. And the first score that I wanted to talk about here is The Fury from 1978, specifically a cue called Jillian's Power. This is one of the very few outright horror scores that Williams has composed so far, and I think it's a great one. This cue kind of sums up the entire score to me. It's unabashedly big, it's way over the top. It goes beyond being operatic to like something cranked up even further than that. It eventually reaches this very powerful orchestral explosion, complete with a theremin to add some extra eeriness because the cue just wasn't cranked up to 11 enough without the theremin. And if you watch the film, this music is a perfect match for the scene that it accompanies, which is one of the most ridiculous and stunning villain deaths that you will ever see in a movie. It's remarkable. So let's listen to Jillian's power from the Fury.
Yeah, that theremin is wild.
It just adds so much. I mean, it's such a wonderful little touch to sort of add an extra element of weirdness and sort of this other world, because there's a supernatural thing that is happening in this scene. So I can understand why Williams would say, I'm going to throw a theremin in here just because it's fun.
All right, jumping into another, I guess horror-related
Horror-ish.
movie. Yeah, we'll be touching on The Witches of Eastwick here from 1987, with the cue "Dance of the Witches." And Williams is pretty much in full mischief mode here with this waltz, and you get a big homage to Dance Macabre in this cue with the atonal violin, especially. But it also really gives you a sense that we are dancing with witches.
Yeah, the main theme that you hear in this cue is just so catchy. It's an earworm. Like once
Mm-hmm.
you hear it, like it'll be stuck in your head for a while. And it's a good example of how, who knows exactly what Williams' process was when he like comes up with a theme like this. It seems like it's effortless, and I'm sure it's not.
Right.
But this is definitely one of his catchier motifs for sure. My next pick from the golden era is from Hook, and it's the cue presenting the hook. And I think I've mentioned in a previous episode somewhere that Hook is one of my very favorite Williams scores.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the day that you ask me, it might be my absolute favorite. It's really just an incredible thematic symphony. There are like a dozen distinct individual motifs that get development throughout this score. It's incredible. And this cue highlights some of the pirate material from the score. It's sort of perfect music for scoundrels. It's got this prancing, playful quality, but there's just a touch of menace as well. And it grows gradually more and more bombastic and larger than life, which sort of fits the personality of Captain Hook himself very, very well.
All right, for my last pick in this era, I'll be highlighting JFK from 1992, specifically the prologue. Now, I was being very indecisive with putting this on here, but I'm not sure if there are any notable predecessors to how this score sounds, but I think with JFK, he's really created the quintessential president or American history sound that is kind of imitated today. I don't know, maybe it's the role of the snare drum or the solo trumpet that kind of evokes a sort of reverent homage to taps. But it's a majestic cue that's just really worth a listen.
All right, now we're going to move forward into the experimental era. And the first score that I wanted to highlight here is from the legendary classic Stepmom. Everyone loves Stepmom, right? Everyone's seen it? Maybe not.
No.
So the cue that I wanted to touch on here is called The Days Between. And this is very sensitive and emotionally grounded material from John Williams. It's not saccharine, and in the wrong hands, it probably would have been. The movie is a domestic drama, so Williams probably knew he couldn't take it over the top in the way he could if it was like a fantasy, an overt fantasy. So he threads the needle of being affecting without being cloying. So, in particular, in this cue, there's beautiful woodwind, piano, and guitar solos that have a very gentle, I mean, you could almost say maybe a soothing quality that I think really, really works. And it's a distinctly different mode for Williams, but yet, in terms of the thematic writing, you can still say, well, this sounds like John Williams music. So here's The Days Between from Stepmom.
All right, the next pick I'm going to highlight is from Minority Report from 2002. And the cue is called A New Beginning. And I love this cue because it seems to take its time in contrast to some of the other more action-oriented pieces in this score. So not only that, there are some really beautiful counter melodies at play here with the strings and woodwinds.
one thing that always stands out to me in this cue is the way that Williams sort of has different sections of the orchestra playing the same sort of melody, but they're staggered. So there's an
Mm-hmm.
overlapping quality that I think is just beautiful. All right, so my next pick is from War of the Worlds, 2005, and it's a cue called Reaching the Country. Now, I think this is one of Williams' darkest scores. It's not an easy one to just sit down and listen to because there really isn't a ton of easily identifiable thematic material that you can grab onto and that sort of is memorable. This cue, however, is an example of that tragic kind of writing that I mentioned earlier. It really sells this sense of danger, a sense of doom, and it does so with real sort of weight and heft. Like the movie is about an alien invasion, which, on a surface level is a silly concept, but Williams is treating this emotionally like he might as well be scoring the Holocaust. It's very effective.
Yeah, I feel like with some of the brass in there, especially towards the end, you get kind of this, I don't know if it's like a tip of the hat to the tripods in the movie. There is that kind of blast from the brass that we hear.
Yes.
That's also just a little bit of an interesting touch. All right, the next one here is from Angela's Ashes from 1999. Now, this particular album aggravates me because they included narration in the opening of all the tracks.
Yes.
And it's like, if I wanted to hear that, I would have gotten the freaking audiobook. Just let me hear the music. Anyhow, I wanted to highlight this cue here called The Lanes of Limerick because of how beautiful and idyllic the solo harp sounds here. And it's not something that we normally hear from Williams. And, I think we hear it a little bit in the Fluffy's harp cue in Harry Potter. But I want more of it. Give me more harp.